Good day to you from wherever in the world you are watching us. My name is Susana Malcorra. I am the Dean of the School of Global and Public Affairs at IE University in Spain, where we are hosting this event. This is going to be a very, very interesting conversation we are going to have about a subject that we all care so much about. We are going to have here the Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of Spain, Arantxa González, and unfortunately, we will not be able to have the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden due to a very last-minute, unexpected commitment. But she sends her regrets, and I'm sure we're going to count with her in the next event. It is with great pleasure that we are going to introduce today to you a paper that Bruce Jones from the Brookings Institution and myself have written to discuss, to tease the notion of this conversation around what is the multilateral world today and what we can do about it looking towards the future. It is indeed a very, very unique moment in which after the United Nations General Assembly celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations creation, there is a request to the Secretary General to produce an analysis, an evaluation, an assessment on how to revitalize the United Nations. That's not the only process we have going on. There are indeed many governments and civil society institutions that are gathering to discuss what is ahead of us, what are the challenges that we face, and how we can do to change this reality where we are immersed, particularly after this pandemic has hit us and has proven that cooperation has reached certain limits. Our intention is to have a series of papers to further this discussion, to further this conversation, to produce alternatives that governments and institutions can look into from an academic perspective, to feed into this conversation. And we hope to do it in a manner that really accelerates the thinking, allows us to think a little bit out of the box so we can go ahead with the hope that we will find new paths to overcome this stalemate we are facing. So to begin, let me ask my colleague and friend Bruce Jones from the Brookings Institution to join us. And before giving him the virtual floor, let me alert you that you will have the chat to send your questions, and we will try to answer as many of them, the minister and ourselves, if time allows. So, Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can I just check, do you hear me well?
Yes, we do.
Very good. Thank you, Susanna, and it's a pleasure to be with you and with the minister, who I'm very appreciative of joining us today. Let me start where our report does, with our argument that the current crisis of order stems from much more than just the anti-multilateral instincts of some contemporary leaders. It has deeper roots and has been more than a decade in the making. The report that we're publishing today, which we called Competing for Order, looks back through the past decade and a half to chart the evolution of this crisis. I won't spend time looking back today. I think it's only worth stressing that while, of course, the world that we live in now would look different had Hillary Clinton been elected instead of Donald Trump, or had the Brexit referendum gone another way, the fact of the matter is that there were already powerful changes underway in the real dynamics of international security, of globalization, and the structure of power that we would be grappling with today, whoever was in the White House or 10 Downing Street. In our report, we lay out several sets of major developments that eroded the performance of the multilateral order and confidence in it, and that we have to address if we want to see a revitalization of that system. One has to do with peace and security. In the heyday of international cooperation, working together to tackle insecurity and violence was a hallmark of the innovations and the dynamism and of great power unity, or at least comity, in the international system. But that progress has stalled and even reversed. Today, the main dynamic which impedes conflict management is the fusion of transnational terrorism and civil war. More than 90% of all deaths in war in the past 5 years occurred in countries in which a terrorist organization, as this is designated by the UN Security Council, was operating. This violence is obviously heavily concentrated in the Middle East and has generated very high death tolls, as well as large-scale refugee flows, and eventually region-wide tensions, which are also expanding into geopolitical tension. This has overtaken multilateral conflict management efforts. And without a serious retooling, I think we will see the multilateral system continue to be stymied from acting in these critical cases. And it's a dynamic which should cause us to ask how we can adapt the conflict management instruments and arrangements of this era to address the peace and security challenges of our time. Second, and maybe even more consequential politically, is the reversals in political support for globalization. I think this issue is well understood. We don't need to go into the details here. I would just note that the deepening of anti-globalization perspective is not a left-right issue. In Europe, in the US, in Latin America, from left, from right, and even from center, there are now growing questions about the merits of continued reliance on expansive globalization and globalized supply chains. The way I would approach this, and the way we address this in the paper, is we ask, can the benefits associated with widespread globalization be preserved while the associated negative dimensions are substantially reduced? And how can we introduce greater resilience? Third is global public goods. This is an issue which has been given less public attention than perhaps was necessary, but the COVID-19 pandemic provides with a vivid realization of the consequences of underinvesting in global public goods like global public health. And it's arguably in this area that the contemporary anti-multilateralist mood, both in the United States and elsewhere, is most damaging. If the politics of withdrawalism continue in the United States, it's going to be very hard to efficiently organize global public goods, but some parts of a global response can be carried out by others, notably by middle powers, both of the West and of the global South. And so the question that Susanna and I pose is, what is the most powerful, viable coalition that can be assembled to protect and preserve the instruments for the provision of global public goods from both the forces of authoritarianism on the one hand and the politics of nationalist isolationism on the other? Fourth, and in wrapping all of this, is rising geopolitical tensions. And the rise in geopolitical tensions during the past decade not only complicates every facet of the multilateral order, it also constitutes a major challenge in its own right. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, we face a serious prospect of large-scale military hostilities between the world's major military powers. That is not always seen as part of the agenda of the multilateral order, but it's actually central to it. So the geopolitical challenge exists on 3 levels. It's a direct threat to international peace and security in its own right. It's a challenge to the liberal basis of the multilateral system, and it complicates efforts to solve the other problems. And so we ask 3 further questions. Can we build effective guardrails against great power confrontation? What kind of middle diplomacy could help? What kind of new arrangements could help? Can we revive older understandings of the UN as an instrument for great power security management? How can key liberal values that have been advanced by the multilateral system be protected? And what are the feasible coalitions for action to tackle the global issues in the absence of great power unity? The baseline reality that emerges is twofold: that the multilateral order is in serious peril, and that multilateral institutions themselves are now a zone of rivalry. The outcome of the election in the United States in November will shape these dynamics in important ways, but it would be foolhardy to believe that even under a Biden presidency, the geopolitical competition would recede, or that we would suddenly see a gushing enthusiasm for expansive globalization, or that we will see an improvement in US-China relations. So we argue in the conclusion that what we call competitive multilateralism, the dynamics of that competition within the multilateral system, constitute the best case scenario, a competitive struggle for the policy and character of the multilateral order. There are much worse potential scenarios: a full-blown breakdown in great power military restraint, a full-scale breakdown in the provision of global public goods, a return to proxy warfare. What is not a credible scenario is a return to the unity and cooperation of the post-Cold War era. So effective policy to rejuvenate the multilateral order can't be premised on a kind of a false hope of a return to the golden age of multilateralism, but instead should take the dynamic of major power rivalry as its premise and this reality of competitive multilateralism as the planning case. We see 3 essential steps to move forward, and then I'll close. First, the forging of a coalition of democratic states to advance the liberal agenda, working within key international institutions to protect that agenda. Second, a network of middle powers to protect key multilateral institutions and to work across key crises to hold the floor on frameworks for cooperation. And third, quiet diplomacy and policy innovation by the major and the middle powers to develop these guardrails against great power conflict, without which we will see the rest of the system torn down. And with that, I'll turn the floor back over to my friend and colleague, Susanna.
Thank you, Bruce. It was a good definition of what our paper says, and it's a good entry to what we are going to see now, which is the keynote speech, I will say, given the fact that she is our only person invited today, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union, and Cooperation of Spain. The Minister Arantxa González, is somebody who not only represents his country well, and as we see by the issues raised in the description that Bruce just took us through, Spain should be a critical player within this new scenario. But Arantxa, a good friend of mine also, has a long experience in the multilateral system. Not only she worked in the European Union, she has a long-standing experience in the United Nations system, both in the World Trade Organization and in the International Trade Center, where she was the executive director, until she became the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain. So it is with real pleasure that I welcome the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, my friend, colleague, Arantxa. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing your views given this landscape that we just described.
Well, thank you very much, Susanna. Thank you, Bruce. It really is a pleasure to accompany you in this trouble in which what you want to do. And let me tell you that we very much support you on this endeavor from Spain, which is put a bit of order in this very disorderly multilateral system that we see today. And to do this, as we celebrate 75 years of the creation of the United Nations, with the opportunity that we have maybe to try and do a bit of a refoundation of this multilateral system. Let me start with a few remarks and then a few suggestions about avenues where we could work on, and which I very much hope the papers that you will be producing can focus and dig deeper. In terms of remarks that I draw from reading your excellent paper, I would say that multilateralism has never been a smooth, direct and constant road. So in my view, we have to avoid the syndrome of the past was always brighter and we now need to go back to some sort of golden age. It's never really been a very direct drive to this golden age. It's international cooperation has had incredible ups, and it also has had incredible downs, even before 1945. This is the system that we remember, but if we go a little bit back in time, we also see what happened before in terms of international cooperation, for example, with the League of Nations. In my view, what's important is to understand that after a major conflict, after a major incident, after a major clash, energy was created that helped us in advancing international cooperation. And maybe today is one of these moments, with the confluence of a number of factors that you very well explain in your paper, that can give us this impulse that we need to give another twist to the multilateral system, understanding that there are a number of elements that are specific to today's situation. One of the elements is that we've got many more powerful actors than in the last 50 years, but no real leader in this multilateral system. Number two, that the system, the multilateral system we currently inhabit was built vertically. One system for agriculture, one system for trade, one system for humanitarian support, one system for intellectual property, one system for health. Whereas what we know is that today the world is much more horizontal, that all these issues are linked together, but we are short of instruments and short of locus, where locus stand, the place where we are going to address all this in a horizontal way, all these different aspects. We also see areas of extreme fragility, of extreme instability. They need to be, those areas, these places, need to be treated very specifically because they constitute incredible fragility, not only there, but with a spread effect on large parts of our world. Finally, and I think that is also worrying, we have seen an erosion of multilateral culture. We've gone back to this idea that was first invented in 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia, that is the nations that are strong and can therefore protect citizens. And this erosion of culture is also something that we need to fight against if we are to rebuild multilateralism. And yet, if I look at all these shortcomings, I also see an incredible moment under the United Nations with the approval of the Agenda 2030, this incredible program where from common diagnostics, all countries in the United Nations agreed a program of work to improve on all fronts and do it together, in a way, build back better, with this terminology that we've invented now, by 2030. So we are not starting this journey to retool multilateralism from scratch. We've got there the program of work and the consensus on the diagnostics. Now, how do we move forward now? I think there are a few areas that merit a specific attention. The first would be health. Given where we are today, confronting a pandemic, and where we've seen the shortcomings of the international system of cooperation on health, where we've understood that animal, plant, and human health have to be brought together, that it's not enough to treat them vertically, that we need to find solutions that look at them horizontally, where we've seen the importance of giving more power to science, and science here is the World Health Organization, giving this organization more ability to tell us what is happening, what should be done, and how we can do this together. Preparedness protocols, analysis, common matrix. In a way, the acid test of whether or not we are capable of building this much stronger World Health Organization will be, the acid test would be access, equitable and fair to vaccines and treatment to fight against COVID, because it will be an expression of whether or not we are ready to, in a way, make multilateralism work where it is needed most today. Number two, I think we've got to look very carefully about conflict management tools. The tools that we have, understanding that the UN Charter and its principles remain as valid today as they were back in 45, but the tools that we have to manage conflicts and crises can no longer be purely seen through the national lens. A lot of the challenges we are confronting on the security front are transnational, including a very complicated one, which is fighting against terrorism or fighting against cybercrime, which by definition know no borders. Number three, urgency in fighting against climate change. I think here the collective investment to give us the ability to do so is incredible. We've got momentum. We've just heard, and I think this was a very important signal last week in the UN General Assembly, a major emitter called China commit to become carbon neutral by 2060. And although 2060 seems far away, it is a clear statement of the determination of this country to walk towards a decarbonized future. So climate change as the one where we've got wind in our sails, gender equality as one which frankly should be a low-hanging fruit, an incredible opportunity to demonstrate that we mean it when we say that all humans are equal, and fighting against inequalities as our most urgent task if we are to provide people with the security that they are asking us for. In terms of how do we do this, I'm being particularly choosy. I think there are many other things that I could go into, but I wanted to zoom in on there where I think there is a specific urgency and a specific opportunity. In terms of how do we do this, I think I'd like to put forward 5 suggestions. Number one, the idea that multilateral governance in the 21st century is not the sole domain of nation states, of governments. It has to go well beyond that. We need to embark in this exercise, private sector, civil society, non-state actors, if we are to be efficient at tackling challenges. So multilateralism has to be beyond the remit of governments. Number two, governance is not only about building treaties or edicting laws, it is also about codes of conduct, about rules on good behavior, about guidelines, softer forms of governance that can help us in advancing consensus to fight transnational issues. And here I'm thinking about technology and the digital space, which number 3 is an area that requires a serious look at governance, given the huge ramifications that technology and the digital space have for economies and societies alike. Number 4, the idea that we need to construct this new governance from a much more horizontal point of view. And if you want an example of this, I think migrations and the governance of migrations worldwide is a good example of that, an area which does not lend itself to a purely vertical approach, but it's at the intersection of many different areas of our society and our economy. And finally, that there may be difficulties in having all members of the international community advance together, that we may have to do this in coalitions, in alliances, but that they can become precursors of movements that can then embark the entire global community. So a few thoughts, Susanna and Bruce, to kick this discussion. Again, not by no means complete, but which I hope can ignite a bit of a conversation for today and give some food for thought for the future papers that you will be putting together, and that our own staff here at the Ministry would be happy to contribute to.
Thank you, Arantxa. A lot of food for thought, I should say. Many new angles you have introduced, not only the perspectives that Bruce spoke about at the beginning, but also the fact that we have a horizontal problem in multilateralism that goes beyond or starts before this last crisis, the notion of stockpiles that are so divided that we cannot look through. Then, of course, the notion that many people speak about of recognizing that whatever we do in a multilateral system has to go beyond member states. It has to include a much broader set of stakeholders, clearly civil society, but private sector, and there are different actors that today should play a critical role and play a marginal role, that are invited in an ad hoc manner. And of course, you also spoke about this idea of having coalitions of the ones who share perspectives, which we address in our report. So maybe I would like to start from there and ask you the first question. How do you see middle powers really playing a central role in this new multilateralism that we see as a competitive one. How do you see countries like Spain coming together to really look into the issues and step up to this geopolitical tension and try to move forward an agenda that is totally revitalized beyond what is happening in the geopolitical tensions?
I think there is a bigger space for mid-sized countries, for mid-sized economies, for mid-sized powers to come together and exercise a little bit of leadership. Sometimes, and this is an observation from maybe my past life in international organizations, I saw that sometimes middle powers are not really conscious of the power they have when they come together. They can constitute a multipole of leadership. A multitude of mid-sized powers can become leaders on a topic. This is what we've seen on issues like, for example, fighting against the death penalty. It's been driven by a coalition led by a multitude of mid-sized powers. But it's true that sometimes, again, by lack of conscience, or sometimes by a concern that whatever they want to do may not be taken nicely by some of the big guys, there is a bit of reluctance to move. I think at the moment there is a bigger space, and actually there is a big responsibility, in my view, to advance responses by coming together and building these coalitions that can help exit the impasse that the conflict between the big powers can put us in. If I look at the international scene, I think the international trading system is a good example of that. How maybe the big conflict between the US and China should not prevent those that are in the middle from trying to advance solutions that can help in building this system of international governance.
Well, you said it, Minister. You said sometimes middle powers are afraid of the big ones and are afraid to stick their neck out just because there could be consequences to that. So that is one of the issues I believe we need to tackle when we think about how we move ahead. Bruce, would you like to chip in here?
Thank you. Yes, and again, very much appreciated the minister's remarks. Two thoughts in reaction. On this second point, the point about the middle powers potentially having leadership roles but being nervous about the consequences. It's where I think it's very important to see an intensification of the effort across a number of these governments to find common positions and to recognize that responsibility that the minister described. I think of the potential impact if you had Berlin, Madrid, London, New Delhi, Tokyo, Ottawa, working together to come up with a common position or a common approach to solving a problem. It would be extremely difficult for either Washington or Beijing to ignore that effort or to try to impose costs on those countries, the way it's actually pretty easy for Washington or Beijing to impose costs on multilateral institutions or smaller powers. So those kinds of groupings of middle powers working together to try to tackle some of these issues, I think becomes extremely important, and extremely important that they be groupings that move across regions. To my mind, and we say this in the paper, the participation of India, the participation of Japan becomes extremely important. A lot of middle power efforts in the past couple of decades were led by the Europeans. It's still extremely important to have the Europeans, but we should also be looking to have countries like India and Japan playing leadership roles. We've seen some of that, Tokyo particularly on picking up the TPP-11 after the United States walked away. The second thought I had when you described the need to go horizontal and the need to go below and above the state, so to speak. The one concern I have is then a kind of a degree of complexity. And it increases the case for thinking about these groupings of middle powers. The way I see this emerging is a kind of concentric circles. If you have a complex issue which involves the private sector and civil society and multiple different issue sets, it's going to be very hard to negotiate issues with 192 governments in the room in that way. But you can have small groups of actors driving a potential solution, taking it to wider bodies like the G20, taking it to broader instruments for driving coalitions and potentially eventually to universal bodies. I think there are, however, also going to be places where we have to recognize that the United States, China, and others are simply going to be on different sides of issues, and that we're not looking for anything like universal solutions. What we're looking for is the widest possible coalition of action to defend a particular approach, and that's going to be especially true when it involves liberal values of a variety of types, whether that's human rights or gender equality or other issues. And we're not going to be looking for universal action. We're going to be looking for wide coalitions to try to defend those values and those approaches.
Well, there I will add one thing, Bruce, and maybe this takes me back to Arantxa. The multilateral system has a principle, which is the principle of consensus, which is a principle that has built a lot and has taken us very far in many ways. But it's also true that in times of a multilateral competition, consensus can be used as a tool to block things. That takes us back to this idea of the concentric circles around different issues. How do you see the balance, Arantxa, between the notion of as broad as possible a consensus, but recognizing that in order to advance agendas, you have to be more precise, more surgical?
Yeah, I think consensus, which is not to be confused with unanimity. There is a tendency to confuse the two, and it's not exactly the same. Consensus is the tool that was used in order to make sure that any action at the international level can be based on as wide as possible support. And consensus, in this sense, in the international at the international level, would mean that we try to, through a process of dialogue and through a process of discussion and through a process of negotiation, we make everybody feel comfortable with how we are going to respond to an issue, be it access to medicines, be it financing agricultural development, be it a set of recommendations, be it a code of conduct, because let's face it, not everything internationally is about treaties and laws. We are also internationally sometimes just simply looking for coordinated responses. For example, when we face a situation of hunger, we want everybody to coordinate the actions to respond to this. Or sometimes what we're looking for is financing, not necessarily, again, always treaties and law. Consensus is the mechanism to make sure everybody feels ownership, in a way, of the problem and ownership of the solution. Now, very often in many international organizations, consensus has been confused with unanimity, meaning that everybody had to express a yes vote, or let's say anybody could just simply block any topic by saying, sorry, I object to this issue being discussed or being addressed. And I think this is where we have to find lighter mechanisms to advance solutions. I think it's there that coalitions, in my view, are intelligent, although they are the suboptimal product. The optimal one is that everybody feels ownership of a certain problem and of a certain response to that certain problem. If it cannot be done, then we have to go, in my view, with trying to provide a response to this issue by building alliances or coalitions that are a little bit less than universal.
Well, you have hit the nail on the head by comparing consensus to unanimity. you and I know that often is the case where consensus is defined as unanimity within the multilateral system, and has gotten us to points where we were totally stalled in solving different issues. So we are in a situation where that understanding of consensus did not allow us to move forward. Also, at a moment where it looks like you have to choose between one big power or the other and align yourself, neither of those solutions are really reasonable to move the agenda in the way we believe it should be moved. So the question is, how do you see we can address moving the notion of the values, the principles that have been central to multilateral order so far, the values of human rights, the principles of a democracy, in a context where one of the big powers is not so attuned to them? And how do you see those coalitions moving it in a manner that it will expand as broadly as possible, but it will continue to have a conversation with both powers in order not to break the dialogue, but keeping in mind that those principles are central to the Charter of the United Nations?
Yeah, and I think this is a very important conversation. The international system is not just a collection of institutions that deal with issues. It's also an understanding of principles, of values. And these values and these principles are described in a charter. And they are also an integral part of an international order. Principles, values, and institutions are the integral ingredients in this order. Now, it is true that countries having signed those principles and those values have different understanding of these principles and these values. And some actually don't follow these principles and these values. And this is why we have also internationally processes and procedures that help us look at how these principles, these values that are important, respect for human rights, that are everybody's rights, not just the rights of citizens in some countries or in some parts of some countries. They are central to the notion that it's a universal system. It's true that it's not. This is the theory. It's not the reality. Now, in my view, on this one, we have to be humble because these values and these principles, including human rights, are violated in many places in the world, not just in one place or in some places, but in many places. So we've got to be humble about the necessity to evaluate ourselves, to look at how we are behaving, to make sure that we uphold the compromise and build a culture of respect for those rights. Not just a policing mechanism to ensure the rights are respected, but a culture where citizens, empowered citizens, are also working to ask their governments and institutions to respect those rights. And again, I know that in saying this, it is not easy, but I am more not just in favor of having sticks, but also in having an approach that helps individuals, groups, citizens to demand that their rights be respected and create those spaces also internationally. This is why I think governance in the 21st century is not just the business of governments. It has to go beyond that. And this is particularly important in this area of rights, of values that are not just the business of governments. It is obviously the business of governments, but it's also about citizens.
Thank you, Arantxa. Bruce, I would like to have your perspective, and maybe if you want to put forward any question to the minister, we can get it from there also.
Well, just a couple of reflections. I spent the first portion of my career in the SecGen's office and then in the peace and security apparatus of the UN. And in that world, consensus meant Washington agreed, then you checked with London and Paris, and then you acted. That was the old reality. It was an easy reality. Now, of course, the new reality is much more complicated. And what I worry about is that what is lost in this new reality is the ability to act quickly, nimbly in crisis. When we have to consult with a dozen people, a dozen governments in order to be able to put on an operation, then life becomes much less nimble. And some of the successes of the multilateral system in the 90s and the early 2000s was a function of its ability to act very quickly in response to humanitarian crises, in response to security crises, etc. And so I'm constantly looking for the smallest possible coalition for quick action on issues like international security, while of course you need wider coalitions on issues like trade and public health, and etc. I guess the question I'd like to ask the minister is how she sees sort of hard security issues fitting into this equation. We are watching an arms race in the Western Pacific. We are watching an arms race in the technological sphere. We are watching a ratcheting it up of tensions between the world's top military powers. In the past, the multilateral system was one part of how we grappled with that issue. Obviously, not the whole part. Obviously, bilateral relations, bilateral arms control arrangements are critical. But the multilateral system was also part of it. UN Security Council, arms control arrangements, etc. And I'd like to push the minister a little bit to reflect on how she sees trying to advance the instruments for the management of international security, for putting up these guardrails against serious conflict on the world stage, and what her thinking is on those issues.
Yeah, I think that, Bruce, this is a tough area. Because this is what I call the carnivores, right? This is the toughest part. I think if I look at the international scene, we've been much better at inventing nimbler ways of dealing with humanitarian issues than we have been about dealing with hardcore defense issues or security issues. That's tough. Now, what I would say is that today I'm concerned because what I see is a erosion of the system that we built in the 20th century, a system of arms control with very clear actors. I see a deliberate erosion of this mechanism, and I do not see still today by what we will replace this 20th century system. I know and this is important in my view for the conversation moving forward, that this issue is no longer just about the US and Russia. Today, this discussion is much broader. In the 20th century, it was very focused on the US and Russia. And in the 20th century, it was very much focused on missiles, nuclear heads. And we know that in the 21st century, the weaponry, the arms that we are trying to control go much beyond that. So in a way where we need a very serious effort, this is why I put this into the list of priorities. Short term is to look at how do we build another system of arms control that where countries understand, and we have to start from the underlying why do we want to do this? Because this is in a system where anybody can destroy the world, it's better to put everybody, to limit everybody's ability to destroy the world. That's in a nutshell why we want to go back to this very basic notion that worked in the 20th century. So we've got to do an update of this version 21st century, more actors, different arms, but still the same need. If we are to provide security to our citizens, we need to restrain the use of weapons version 21st century. And it's hard, I can tell you.
Well, you had connected again the question of technology, the question of security, the fact that technology plays a critical role not only in globalizing our world, but also plays a critical role in security given the new weapons based on technology. You have said before that technology was one of those pillars that require a different attention from the multilateral system, that there was no a defined space for it at this very moment. One will argue the same applies to these new security challenges. One could add that a taxation system that encompasses the whole world and includes the needs brought to the forefront by the new technological companies is another one. How do you see starting this conversation? Where do you see this conversation should start? Because it's clear that in the connection with the Security Council, you will be in a deadlock situation, given the realities of the Security Council today. And there is no a clear place. So will you start these conversations in subgroups of states, subgroups of countries that will be willing to move a certain part of this agenda to try and expand it to the extent possible? Will that be the way you will approach it?
First, again, I think we should start with the why. And the why is that the social contract of the 21st century cannot sustain a big part of the economy simply not contributing. The reality is that today we've got a huge disparity between the analog economy and the digital economy as regards taxation. And a big part of it simply is not taxed. And politically, this is not sustainable in our democracies. It is just simply not possible. So this conversation has already started. The place where it has started is the OECD. Granted, the OECD does not have all actors around the table, and this is where an OECD expanded table would probably be a good place to continue this conversation. The first chapter in this conversation was countries unilaterally seeing that this would be a problem if it wasn't addressed, and therefore indicating that they would want to do this individually as countries. Stage two was basically with countries realizing that it would be more efficient if they were to do this collectively, and it would also be probably easier for businesses to respond to one set of rules, one set of principles, not a different set of rules and different set of principles depending on which country would adopt digital taxes. And stage number three is where we are today, which is trying to get the system to work. But I think on this one, we have to be extremely lucid. This is not about one country against another country. Say, it's not about Europe against America or Europe against China wanting to tax digital companies. It is about the social contract that underlies in our economies. And if we want this license to operate, this social contract, to be accepted and acceptable by all our citizens, we have taxation is an important part of it. So we at least here in Spain, where we are very clear about the need to tax digitally powered activities. We are not doing this to penalize this or that company. We are also imposing the same rules on our own Spanish or European companies, but we see this as integral to the fairness of the economic system in which these companies operate. Because otherwise what we will have is an erosion of our democracies, and this is something that, frankly, we cannot afford.
Well, again, we can see the interconnection of all these issues. There is a question coming from our audience that I will pose to both of you. And the question is, do we believe that this revitalization of multilateralism is essentially tied to the fate of the recognition of globalization, of a new globalization in the world? Is that how we see it? And I will ask first Arantxa.
Well, I would say that this revised or revitalized multilateralism is a response to a change in globalization, but it's also tied to the unstable state of affairs in our world. Which also has to do with a different distribution of powers globally, that with this new multipolarity, that in a way questions, some of the actors question the system in which they are operating, where they feel they did not participate in the building of the system, and therefore they don't feel ownership over the system. So it responds to these two things. One is the necessity to better regulate globalization version 21st century, much more digitally powered, with a greater conscience of the planetary boundaries, with a very clear sense that inequalities cannot just simply continue unchecked, but also a much more multipolar world, and a desire and a necessity to build this system of international governance where everybody feels a stake.
Bruce?
I had two thoughts, one going back to the last topic and then one on this question. On the last topic, the difficulty of the hard power arrangements of the international security issues. One thing just to remind us all, at a key point in the post-Cold War order, when chemical weapons were growing in use and growing in risk, Australia did the quiet diplomacy and then eventually the kind of travel diplomacy, and brokered an agreement which involved corporations, which involved industry, government, science, etc., and resulted ultimately in the Chemical Weapons Convention. So it's just, again, a reflection that middle powers, when they put their minds to this diplomacy, can actually carve out space for arrangements that, at least to some degree, limit new weapons and limit new actors. So it's a useful reminder. On globalization and multilateralism, I think we are watching a critical moment emerge where we will see pretty soon whether we continue down the pathway of ever widening, ever deepening globalization. I think that's unlikely. We could see a serious retrenchment. You hear a lot of governments talking about sort of onshoring, creating greater resilience in supply chains, by which they mean moving manufacturing of critical industries back into their own territories, etc. I think that's going to be exceedingly difficult. And what we may watch emerge is a kind of two globalizations. One which is very much embedded in the West and the liberal world as a whole, which preoccupies itself by issues of digital privacy, which preoccupies itself by the kind of nature of technology issues, which has certain values inherent in it and works to protect those values. And one which is oriented around the Chinese market and a very different approach to that set of questions. That's not necessarily a breakdown of globalization. That's not necessarily the emergence of a kind of bipolar or two systems world. It could be two globalizations that interact and interplay with one another. And I think we would see countries like Singapore operating in both zones, but it will be a very tense and difficult issue. And how we handle it in multilateral terms will be tense and tricky. I think we're at that pivot now. And if we can move fairly swiftly on some of the ideas that the minister put forward, some of the ideas we have in our paper, and sort of limit the breaking apart of the existing systems, then I think we could retain a single globalization and minimize its limitations. But pretty soon we're going to end up in a world of two globalizations. And then the risk will be the emergence of bipolarity of a type we're familiar with and was so damaging for so long.
Maybe there is a question that I would like to put forward to the minister, and this has to do, being myself from Argentina, has to do with how do we make sure that this is whatever way we move forward, we include properly countries from the South, countries that have a different challenge before them, but also can make a difference in enabling that broad sense of coalitions and associations. How do we do that in a manner that is constructive and gets us to solutions that are embraced as broadly as possible beyond the middle powers?
Well, first, a lot of these middle powers are in the south. They are not in the north. They are in the south. And we just need to look at the figures, whether it's by population, whether it's by economic size, whether it's by influence on global affairs. The reality is that these mid-sized coalitions cut across the north and the south. I think, and this is what makes governance much more challenging, is that this building of consensus needs to embrace actors that go beyond the usual suspects. It's much wider, is much richer in nuances, in specificities, but it's also much more, it's stronger if we can leverage this diversity in the international scene. What I have witnessed in the World Trade Organization, for example, is that a group of countries are capable, that are mid-sized powers, North and South alike, are capable of moving issues forward and are capable of putting an alternative to paralysis that the big China-US conflict can create here or there. But I don't think in today's world, these mid-size actors are just in the north. They are more and more in the south, whether it's Argentina, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Chile in Latin America, but whether it's Kenya or Nigeria or South Africa or Rwanda, whether it's Malaysia, whether it's India, Indonesia, they are all over the world and they are empowered. Today, a lot of the solutions that we are seeing are coming from them. And this is where I think it's a much more complicated business of building consensus, but it's also it's a system that when we do it is stronger because the voices that have been knitted together can resist much better.
We are hitting pretty much the end of this conversation, which has been so rich and interesting. I will be remiss if we don't ask the minister a question related to COVID, given the circumstances we are facing. So my question to you, Arantxa, is, do you believe that we are going to come out of COVID with a stronger conviction that there is a need for a global governance, for a multilateral a cooperation that is stronger, or do you believe that the alternative view will prevail based on what we see in many parts of the world?
Well, I think it's been pretty sobering to see how many of the issues that can help us get over this pandemic require international cooperation. It's been very sobering. Whether it is vaccines or treatment, it's pretty clear, and everybody understands this today, no one will be safe until everyone is safe. Whether it's on the economic or social recovery, it's no use if Europe recovers, if America or Asia don't recover also, because we are part of the same global economy. It's been very sobering on access to credit and capital, on access to finance. It's been clear also how when we stopped economic activities, we rediscovered our planet and we rediscovered biodiversity. So I think as citizens, what we have seen is the enormous interrelation, the enormous interconnection in our economies, in our social tissues, in our countries. We've seen how when we close one border, it's been dramatic for citizens and for businesses alike. So I think the lesson that citizens have taken from this pandemic is that we are much more interconnected than we thought, and therefore that the management of this interconnection is much more necessary today than before COVID, if we are to build back better, as we call it. What we need to make sure now is that all governments will also listen to this message that their citizens are sending and would be ready to now invest also political capital in building this new international cooperation version 21st century.
My dear Minister, Bruce, we are getting to the end of this time we have dedicated to such a very, very important conversation in a subject that has so many angles, faces so many challenges, and has so many unanswered questions. We did not intend today to answer all those questions. If anything, our intention was to put the questions on the table. The work that we are going to produce from now on, the different reports and future events, will be informed by conversations like this and many others that we will host in order to be able to have more answers to the question. We don't believe we will have the capacity to give a magic solution to such a complex problem, but we do intend to provide as many options as possible. So, Minister Gonzalez, my friend Arantxa, thanks for your time. Thanks for your openness, for sharing with us in such a very, very candid way your perspectives. I know it's difficult being in the position you are, but you are really, really straightforward. Bruce, it's always good to see you. We'll stay in touch. And to the audience, thanks for being with us. And we look forward to you reading our report, which will be posted today. And definitely, we hope to see you again in the future when we come back with more questions and hopefully more answers. Thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.